The question of whether non-religious people are going to hell is one of the most troubling and revealing ideas in all of theology, because at its core, it forces us to ask what kind of universe we live in, and what kind of moral logic could justify eternal punishment for disbelief. For billions of people, the idea of hell is not just metaphorical, it's literal. They are told that those who reject the true faith will be condemned forever. And yet, when you look closer, this claim collapses under its own weight. If someone is born into a family in rural India, grows up Hindu, lives a moral life, and dies never having heard the gospel of Christianity, are they condemned? If someone is born in a Muslim family in Morocco and devotes their entire life to prayer and kindness, do they burn in eternal fire? The very suggestion reveals how much hell is tied to geography, culture, and accident of birth, not to moral character. That realization is where doubt often begins. Because if eternal punishment depends on something as arbitrary as where you were born, then the system doesn't reflect justice, it reflects power and control. Let's talk about justice. Human beings instinctively know that punishment should fit the crime. We design laws with proportionality in mind. Stealing a loaf of bread doesn't deserve a lifetime in prison, let alone eternal torment. And yet many religious doctrines insist that disbelief, simply not accepting a claim, is enough to warrant infinite punishment. This is where logic falls apart. Eternal punishment for finite actions doesn't make sense. More than that, eternal punishment for thought crime, for disbelief, doubt, or being born in the wrong tradition, isn't just unjust, it's cruel. If you compare this with human ethics, the difference is clear. We consider it barbaric when tyrants punish dissent with torture or death, and yet when a deity is imagined to do the same thing on an infinite scale, people are told to call it holy. For many who step away from religion, this contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The concept of hell, when applied to non-religious people, reveals less about morality and more about control. History also sheds light on why hell has been used as a tool against non-believers. In early Christianity, hell wasn't described with much detail. The language was vague, often symbolic. But as the church grew and competed with rival beliefs, the descriptions of hell grew sharper, more terrifying, and more literal. Medieval preachers painted vivid pictures of flames, torture, and endless suffering. Why? Because fear is effective. If you can convince people that rejecting the church means facing unimaginable torment, you hold them in place. And if you can label outsiders, pagans, skeptics, Jews, Muslims, or anyone different as hell-bound, you not only solidify your own group's unity, but justify hostility toward others. So when modern believers tell non-religious people they're destined for hell, they're repeating an old strategy, a strategy designed less to describe reality and more to enforce conformity. Once you see that, the terror of hell loses much of its grip, because what you're looking at isn't a cosmic truth. It's a social invention. There's also the psychological toll. Think about growing up with the idea that anyone outside your faith, even loved ones, are doomed. Children are taught to picture their friends, their grandparents, sometimes even their parents, suffering forever simply because they don't belong to the right tradition. The trauma of that teaching is profound. Psychologists who study religious trauma often hear stories from former believers who carried nightmares, guilt, and panic attacks into adulthood because of hellfire preaching. For non-religious people, being told they're destined for hell can trigger alienation and fear, even when they reject the belief itself. The emotional manipulation lingers. This highlights why the doctrine is so damaging. It doesn't just divide communities, it destabilizes individuals. Instead of encouraging compassion, it weaponizes fear. Instead of inspiring growth, it reinforces submission. The hell narrative, especially when applied to non-religious people, is less about afterlife reality and more about earthly control mechanisms. And then there's the moral contradiction at the heart of it all. Many religions insist their God is loving, merciful, and just. Yet that same God is described as sending people to eternal torment for not believing the right thing. The contradiction is sharp enough to push many thoughtful people out of religion entirely. If love means anything, it cannot coexist with eternal torture. If justice means anything, it cannot treat finite doubts as infinite crimes. And if mercy means anything, it cannot depend on cultural luck. This is why so many non-religious people see the threat of hell as hollow. It doesn't reflect a universe of fairness, but a system of human fear projected onto eternity. To tell someone they're going to hell for being non-religious is less a statement about the cosmos and more a confession of insecurity. It shows that the belief itself cannot stand without threats. When we ask whether non-religious people are going to hell, we have to pause and examine the word itself, hell. What does it even mean? Because across history, cultures, and even denominations within the same religion, the concept looks radically different. In ancient Judaism, there was no fiery underworld of eternal torture. The Hebrew word Sheol described a shadowy pit, a place where all the dead went, regardless of belief or behavior. Early Christians inherited that ambiguity. Later, when Greek ideas about Hades mixed with apocalyptic imagery, hell started to look more like a place of judgment, and by the Middle Ages, European art and preaching turned it into a terrifying underworld filled with fire, demons, and eternal agony. That evolution matters, because when modern believers warn non-religious people about hell, they're usually drawing on a medieval invention, not some unbroken ancient truth. The question, "Are atheists going to hell?" assumes a fixed concept that, historically speaking, has shifted with culture and politics. Recognizing that fact undermines the claim right away. If hell is so elastic, maybe it's not describing reality at all, just the fears and needs of the culture imagining it. Let's also consider how this teaching functions socially. When a group insists outsiders are bound for hell, it builds an in-group and an out-group. The in-group feels chosen, secure, and superior. The out-group is labeled dangerous, lost, or condemned. This division strengthens loyalty within the group, but it comes at a cost. Empathy is weakened, dialogue is discouraged, and fear takes the place of curiosity. Sociologists call this boundary maintenance. It's a way groups preserve themselves. But notice what's happening. The doctrine of hell isn't just about the afterlife, it's about control in the present. By telling believers that non-religious people are destined for eternal fire, leaders reinforce the idea that leaving the group is the worst possible mistake. The irony is that this very system backfires in modern times. When people learn more about other cultures, when they see kind, ethical, loving individuals who don't share their faith, the narrative that outsiders are evil collapses. And once that collapses, the threat of hell rings hollow. Another angle comes from philosophy. If a God exists, who is both all-powerful and all-loving, the concept of hell raises impossible questions. Why create beings who are destined for torment? Why design a system where the majority of humanity, across history, ends up suffering forever just because of birth circumstances or doubt? Philosophers of religion wrestle with this and often respond with free will. They argue that humans choose hell by rejecting God. But this doesn't solve the problem. Because if the choice is between obedience and eternal torture, it isn't a free choice at all. It's coercion. A choice under threat is no choice. This philosophical knot is why many former believers reject the doctrine altogether. They see that a truly moral universe wouldn't hinge on coerced loyalty. And once that realization lands, the threat of hell loses moral credibility. It no longer inspires obedience. It exposes a flaw in the theology itself. Psychologically, the fear of hell has been shown to shape behavior in powerful but often unhealthy ways. Studies in psychology suggest that belief in eternal punishment can increase anxiety, depression, and guilt, especially in children raised with vivid images of fire and torment. Consider a child told that questioning their faith even slightly could lead to eternal flames. The natural curiosity of childhood becomes a source of terror. Doubt, which is a normal part of human growth, is reframed as rebellion deserving infinite pain. Many adults raised in this environment describe leaving religion as a process of unlearning fear. When non-religious people are told they're headed for hell, the intent is often to scare them into conformity. But the real effect, especially in an age where more people are leaving faith, is alienation. It confirms for many that religion isn't offering truth but using threats. That recognition itself pushes people further away from belief. Finally, there's the question of fairness. If hell is real, what does that mean for the billions of people across history who never had the chance to hear about the right faith? Are they automatically condemned? The sheer scale of this injustice makes the doctrine collapse under its own weight. Think of ancient civilizations that thrived long before Christianity or Islam. Think of remote tribes that had no contact with missionaries. Think of children who die young before they can form beliefs. If the answer to all these lives is eternal torment, then the system is grotesquely unfair. For many, this realization is the tipping point. It reveals that the doctrine of hell, especially when applied to non-religious people, isn't describing a just universe. It's describing a man-made system of control and fear. And once you see that, the threat loses its power, because it's not pointing to an afterlife. It's pointing to the insecurities of those who promote it. When someone asks whether non-religious people are going to hell, one way to approach the question is to look at how different religions define salvation. The answer isn't universal. It depends on which tradition you ask. In many branches of Christianity, the answer is yes. Without accepting Jesus, hell awaits. But in Catholic teaching, things are less clear. There are doctrines about invincible ignorance, suggesting that people who never heard of Christianity might not be damned. In Islam, paradise is promised to those who submit to God, but interpretations vary on what happens to people outside the faith. Hinduism and Buddhism often don't have the same concept of eternal hell, but they do describe cycles of rebirth that can include suffering if someone strays from the right path. The point is that the idea of non-religious people being condemned isn't consistent. It's not some universal law. It's an interpretation tied to a particular tradition at a particular time. For many, realizing this is liberating. If even religions can't agree on who's saved and who's damned, why should anyone take the threat of hell as objective truth? There's also the cultural piece. In societies where religion is dominant, hell becomes a way to enforce conformity. Non-religious people aren't just seen as mistaken, they're cast as dangerous, destined for punishment, and deserving of suspicion. This stigma fuels discrimination. In some places, openly non-religious people face social exclusion, job loss, or even violence. And behind much of that hostility is the idea that they're going to hell anyway. Once someone is dehumanized in that way, it becomes easier to mistreat them. But here's the paradox. As more people publicly identify as non-religious, these stereotypes are harder to maintain. It's difficult to claim that atheists are inherently wicked when they're your friends, your neighbors, your co-workers, or your family members. The more visible non-religious people become, the weaker the hell narrative grows. Because reality speaks louder than dogma, we should also think about how the concept of hell interacts with the problem of evil. If the world is already filled with suffering, natural disasters, disease, violence, why would a just and loving deity add eternal torment on top of it? The doctrine of hell doesn't solve the problem of evil, it multiplies it. For non-religious people, this is one of the strongest arguments against hell. Life itself is already hard enough. Children die young, innocent people endure hardship, entire populations face famine or war. To suggest that, after all that, billions of people will face infinite suffering simply because they didn't hold the right beliefs makes the universe look less moral, not more. At some point, many conclude that it's more reasonable to accept that the doctrine is a human creation than to believe in a universe run by such cruelty. In other words, the concept of hell fails as an explanation. It makes less sense of the world, not more. Section 4, approximately 6,000 characters. Let's bring it down to the personal level. Countless people raised in religious settings describe the moment they first asked themselves, "Do I really believe my friends are going to burn forever?" The question is simple, but the emotional impact is massive. Some try to suppress it, repeating the doctrine they were taught. Others wrestle with guilt, feeling compassion for outsiders, but fearing that their compassion contradicts their faith. And many eventually realize that their empathy is pointing them toward a deeper truth, that no just system would demand eternal punishment for finite disbelief. For non-religious people, being told they're going to hell often feels like a dismissal of their humanity. It's not about debate, it's about silencing. But in practice, it pushes people away from faith, because if a belief system requires you to condemn good people to eternal fire, it says more about the system than about those people. Finally, there's the role of knowledge. The more someone studies history, philosophy, science, and psychology, the harder it becomes to reconcile those fields with the literal concept of hell. Science shows us a universe governed by natural laws, not divine punishments. History shows us religions shaping and reshaping doctrines, including hell, over centuries. Psychology shows us how fear and trauma can make people cling to beliefs even when they contradict evidence. Philosophy shows us that infinite punishment for finite disbelief is incoherent. When non-religious people weigh all of this, the threat of hell loses credibility. It becomes less a serious possibility and more a cultural story. And once that shift happens, fear of damnation gives way to a different perspective. The recognition that morality, meaning, and purpose don't require fear of eternal punishment. They require honesty, compassion, and the courage to live fully in this life. Another way to tackle the question is to ask what hell says about the people promoting it. Because when someone insists that non-religious people are doomed to eternal fire, they are revealing something about their worldview. It shows that their system relies not on persuasion, but on fear. If a belief cannot stand on evidence, it must resort to threats, and the biggest threat imaginable is eternal torment. This dynamic is easy to see in history. Hell was preached most intensely during times of instability, when the church wanted to tighten its grip. In periods of reform or social change, threats of damnation became louder. The message was clear: don't question, don't stray, or face unending fire. For many, recognizing this pattern is enough to see through the doctrine. It's not a window into the afterlife, but a reflection of human power struggles. If non-religious people are going to hell, it's less about cosmic justice and more about earthly control. There's also the irony of selective application. Believers may say non-religious people are hellbound, but often they quietly make exceptions for people they love. A Christian might insist that atheists in general are lost, but then soften the rule for their kind-hearted grandmother who never believed. A Muslim might affirm that non-believers face judgment, but then hesitate when thinking of a compassionate neighbor who never prayed. This selective compassion exposes the cracks in the doctrine. Because deep down, most people know it doesn't make sense to condemn someone kind, generous, and moral simply because of disbelief. The heart resists what the doctrine demands. For many former believers, that tension becomes unbearable. They realize that their moral intuition is stronger and more trustworthy than the rigid rules of theology. And once that realization sets in, the threat of hell loses its emotional hold. The concept of hell also reveals how religion can distort the meaning of justice. In human terms, justice is about fairness, proportion, and rehabilitation. A fair justice system punishes wrongdoing in ways that aim to protect society and ideally help the offender improve. But hell isn't about proportion. It's infinite punishment for finite offenses. It isn't about rehabilitation. There's no chance of learning, no chance of growth. And it isn't about fairness. The criteria for damnation often depend more on belief than behavior. This distortion is why so many people step away from religion. They see that the concept of hell doesn't make justice more complete. It undermines it. For non-religious people, the accusation of being hell-bound rings hollow precisely because it contradicts everything we instinctively know about fairness. Another important factor is how hell fuels intolerance. If someone truly believes non-religious people are going to hell, it becomes easier to justify mistreating them now. After all, if they're destined for eternal fire, what's the harm in excluding them, discriminating against them, or denying them equal rights? This logic has played out across history, from persecution of heretics in medieval Europe to witch trials, to modern discrimination against atheists in politics and public life. The idea of hell has often been the foundation for social hostility, and yet reality keeps breaking through. Non-religious people live ethical, fulfilling, compassionate lives. They raise families, build communities, contribute to science and art, and show kindness. The lived experience contradicts the dogma, and when that contradiction becomes clear, the doctrine of hell starts to collapse under its own weight. Finally, we should consider what the fear of hell does to believers themselves. For many, it creates a fragile faith built not on love or conviction, but on terror. They stay in line not because they find the beliefs compelling, but because they're afraid of punishment. This fragility explains why some believers are so insistent that non-religious people are doomed. If others can live freely without fear of hell, it threatens the entire system. It shows that the fear was unnecessary, that people can reject the doctrine and still thrive. For non-religious people, this is why the accusation doesn't land. They see that hell isn't an inevitable reality. It's a psychological cage. And once someone realizes the door is unlocked, they can walk out. Leaving behind the fear doesn't mean losing morality or meaning. It means gaining the freedom to live authentically without threats hanging over their head. One of the clearest signs that the doctrine of hell doesn't hold up is how much it depends on fear rather than evidence. When asked why non-religious people are supposedly going to hell, the answers are rarely grounded in proof. They're grounded in threats. Because the Bible says so, or because my tradition teaches it, or because you'll regret it if you don't believe. This isn't reasoning, it's intimidation. In any other area of life, we wouldn't accept this kind of argument. We don't buy a product because someone says, if you don't, you'll be sorry forever. We don't trust leaders who govern by threats instead of explanations. Yet when it comes to religion, fear is often presented as a legitimate substitute for logic. For non-religious people, this is exactly why the claim that they're going to hell falls flat. It doesn't persuade, it reveals the weakness of the system. Because if a belief requires threats to survive, then it doesn't survive on truth. Another important angle is the diversity of belief even within religious families. In the same household, you might have devout parents, skeptical children, or relatives who drift away from organized faith. If the doctrine of hell were applied strictly, it would divide families into eternal categories, some bound for heaven, others for fire. This raises a painful question. Can love survive that picture? If parents are told their children are destined for eternal torment, what does that do to the meaning of family? If children are told their grandparents are lost forever, how does that shape grief? The truth is, most people quietly soften the doctrine when it comes to loved ones. They say things like, God knows their heart, or maybe they'll be shown mercy. And in doing so, they show that their moral compass is resisting the cruelty of the doctrine. For non-religious people, this inconsistency is revealing. It shows that even believers don't fully accept what they're preaching. We should also consider the historical record of how the threat of hell has been used. Time and again, it appears less as a revelation from beyond and more as a tool of power. Medieval priests described hell in graphic detail during sermons to keep peasants obedient. Colonizers told indigenous populations they were bound for hell unless they converted, using fear as a weapon to erase cultures. Evangelists have used the threat of hell in revival meetings to drive emotional conversions. When you recognize these patterns, the question shifts. It's no longer, are non-religious people going to hell? But why was this idea invented, and who benefits from it? The answer is clear. Those in power benefit. The people who claim to hold the keys to heaven gain influence, authority, and obedience. For non-religious people, this exposes the doctrine as less about divine justice and more about human control. And once that connection is made, the fear of hell loses its foundation, because you see it for what it is, a political tool, not a cosmic truth. There's also the reality of moral diversity. Across cultures and histories, people have developed rich ethical systems without needing belief in hell. Ancient philosophies in Greece, India, and China wrestled with questions of virtue, justice, and compassion without eternal punishment hanging overhead. Non-religious people today live by values like honesty, kindness, responsibility, and fairness, not because they fear fire, but because they care about the world around them. They see morality as something grounded in human relationships, not supernatural threats. So when they're told they're bound for hell, it doesn't connect, because their lived experience contradicts it. They already know they can live meaningful, ethical lives without the fear of damnation. The doctrine doesn't describe reality, it denies it. Ultimately, the question of whether non-religious people are going to hell tells us less about the afterlife and more about the psychology of belief. It reveals how deeply fear can be used to bind communities, how doctrines can be shaped by power, and how individuals wrestle with compassion when it collides with theology. For many, letting go of hell isn't about denying meaning, it's about reclaiming it. It's about recognizing that threats don't create morality, that fear doesn't create love, and that human worth isn't determined by conformity to a doctrine. So when non-religious people hear that they're going to hell, the response is simple. The idea no longer carries weight, because once you see it for what it is, a human story born of fear and power, it loses its grip. What remains is the freedom to live authentically, guided by reason, compassion, and honesty, without fear of eternal fire. If we take the claim seriously that non-religious people are destined for hell, we also have to take seriously what that implies about the nature of belief. It suggests that belief itself is more important than action, that holding the correct idea in your mind outweighs a lifetime of kindness, compassion, or integrity. Think about what that means. A cruel person who happens to believe in the right God is rewarded, while a compassionate non-believer is punished forever. This inversion of morality is striking. It turns ethics upside down, rewarding conformity over character. For non-religious people, this is one of the clearest reasons to reject the doctrine. They see morality as something you live, not something you declare. The threat of hell, then, isn't just wrong, it's insulting to the very idea of justice. Another important consideration is the sheer diversity of non-religious people. They are not a single, uniform group. Some are lifelong skeptics, others left religion after years of devotion. Some are philosophers, others are artists, scientists, activists, or simply ordinary people who live good lives without belief. To paint all of them with the same brush, doomed, condemned, damned, erases the richness of human experience. It flattens billions of lives into a single accusation. This lack of nuance is exactly why the doctrine feels hollow, because real people don't fit into such simple categories. When non-religious people are told they're going to hell, they often recognize immediately how disconnected that is from reality. They know their lives, their values, their choices, and they see that those things cannot be reduced to a single word like lost. We also need to talk about fear itself. Fear can control behavior, but it rarely produces genuine conviction. A child who obeys a parent out of love develops trust. A child who obeys out of fear develops anxiety. The same applies to religion. When belief is motivated by terror of hell, it isn't authentic, it's coerced. Non-religious people often see this clearly. They recognize that if belief must be maintained under threat, it isn't free belief at all. it's submission. And this realization doesn't just undermine the doctrine of hell, it undermines the credibility of the religion that promotes it. Because if truth is really true, it shouldn't need threats to defend it. Consider also the silence of hell in everyday life. Outside of sermons and religious teaching, the world doesn't bear signs of a cosmic sorting system. Natural disasters don't target non-believers. Success and suffering are distributed randomly across both the devout and the skeptical. This equal distribution of life's ups and downs suggests a natural world at work, not a supernatural punishment system. Non-religious people notice this. They see that the real world doesn't reflect the theology they were warned about. And once that disconnect is clear, the threat of hell feels less like a truth about the universe and more like a story layered onto it, a story meant to explain suffering in the past, but now revealed as unnecessary in the present. Finally, we should reflect on the bigger picture. If hell is used to scare non-religious people into belief, what does that say about the supposed message of religion? If love is central, why does fear dominate? If compassion is the goal, why is coercion the tool? For many, these contradictions are decisive. They realize that a system relying on eternal threats cannot possibly reflect ultimate goodness. Instead, it reflects human anxiety, human power, and human attempts to control what cannot be controlled. So when the question comes up, are non-religious people going to hell? The most honest answer is that the doctrine doesn't describe the world we live in. It describes a fear system designed to keep people in line. Once you recognize that, the chains of fear fall away. What's left is not hell, but freedom. The freedom to live without threats hanging over every choice,